She's the pushy broad from the Bronx, New York. Follow her voice, a straight dog is nice. She's a pushy broad from the Bronx, oh yeah. Don't be surprised if you wanna listen twice. Make decisions, find the right choice. Know yourself better, find your own voice. It's okay if you need help today, cause everybody needs a little push. From the pushy broad from the Bronx, New York.
Welcome, Transformation Talk Network listeners. My name is Ellen Stewart, and I am the pushy broad from the Bronx. Welcome to my show, Recovery Recharged, where we share support and advice from experts in addiction and recovery. I have a wonderful guest with me today that's going to talk about a subject that everybody in recovery wonders about and wonders how we can get better. When we talk about recovery, we always talk about being clean and sober from mood-altering drugs. And when we are lucky enough to get a little bit of sobriety, we realize that all of the other things in our life come flooding through. And one of those things is the trauma and the adversity that we suffered, which brought us to this position that we were in to begin with. So today I brought on an expert, someone who's going to talk to us about overcoming adversity and the road to recovery. She is a healer and empowerment coach, and her name is Janessa Finley Ford. Let me just tell you a little bit about Janessa. Janessa is a healer and empowerment coach. She guides leaders and high achievers in overcoming adversity and mastering the art of being human. And I certainly want to ask her about that because there must be an art. Through energy psychology and mindset alignment, she inspires clients to ignite their inner power and turn their adversity into their advantage. And she's done this over the past 20 years. The Pushy Broad from the Bronx and Recovery Recharged welcomes my guest, Janessa Finley Ford. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I am well. It's a delight to join you here, Ellen. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. So let's get into a little bit about what you do, because I found it very intriguing and it wasn't on the normal coaching path. So tell me a little bit about the services of an alternative and holistic health healer. What do you do?
Yeah, my services are designed to empower individuals, as you talked about, using this umbrella of different tools, such as applied kinesiology and tapping, the Enneagram personality structure, to really clear a path for them to release blocks that are keeping them from really thriving in life. And so it's just going beyond the self-sabotage that we unfortunately are really good at creating for ourselves as humans through our unconscious limitations and being able to unleash our true potential.
And what do you mean by energy psychology? That's
That's
interesting.
a great question. Yeah. So it is a family of mind-body methods that decreases stress and trauma and increases calm. And the way it works is that it regulates electrical signals, and when combined with evidence-based exposure therapies, it retrains the brain and it helps individuals to overcome physical and emotional reactions affecting their health and well-being. But I really do want to clarify that the exposure therapy that I'm referencing here is not the exposure to the initial situation that created the trauma or the emotions or thoughts. We are only exposing to the thoughts and the emotions and then going underneath the situation so people don't have to relive it to become free from it.
Give me a concrete example of that.
Sure. So, for instance, I've worked with an individual who, um, gosh, I'm being so mindful because I don't want to cause any secondary trauma to anyone. There
I
was
mean,
a
just generalization, because you say that you talk about bringing out the emotion based on an experience rather than the actual event. So give me an idea of what we're talking about.
Okay, so I'll give you a real life example, and it might actually benefit people on the call rather than secondary trauma. I was on a hike. It ended up being a hike where I got engaged, so I'll never forget this hike, but came upon a woman who was so scared of heights, she was not going to go to the summit of the hike. She was done. She was going to leave her group. She was caught in that fear. So that was the expression, the fear, the phobia. We did some tapping to release that phobia, and with less than 10 minutes, she was back with her group. She went to the summit. She was laughing, enjoying herself. The fright, the fear, the phobia had dissolved.
And what did you do? You gave her some
We did
tapping, you said? You did some
tapping. Yeah.
tapping?
Yep. So
Yes,
we talked about, worst case scenario for her. What was the worst thing that she was fearing in the moment?
sure.
And then we tapped to release the fear and the emotions from the nervous system. And her brain then rewired and decided heights weren't actually going to kill her and she could continue along the hike.
Marvelous. So two wonderful things came out of that hike. Your engagement and you helped someone get over their fear of heights. Marvelous.
Yeah.
Really cool. So very good. Are you talking about EFT tapping, emotional freedom tapping? Is that the technique that you use?
I personally use natural bio de-stressing tapping, which does include EFT, but it also includes TFT. And then there's some other forms of tapping where we're doing eye movement tapping and speaking certain statements of empowerment at the same time. So I use various different types of tapping, but EFT I think is the most common that people are familiar with by and
Sure.
large. Yeah.
And I've had experience, and I also did a small certification in EFT, and sometimes I do call upon it, and it also works for me in many different ways. And in many ways, what you're doing now has been influenced by your childhood. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. When I was young, I experienced a trauma around the age of 8, and I repressed those memories actually. And so as I grew up, I was pretty angsty, pretty unsettled, dealt with some depression in my teen years, really challenged with relationships. I was very defiant with my parents. I had some close friends, but few friends. And I never knew, like, I just thought something was wrong with me. I didn't know the underlying situation because I couldn't even remember it. And so then sports was really my outlet. And while I was playing sports one day, I suffered a concussion around the age of 17. I developed an eating disorder, anorexia and bulimia, and I dealt with that for about 7 years. And I was married really young. I was divorced 1 year later. And these adversities in my life continued to repeat themselves until finally, at the age of 35, the memories came back to me and I was able to actually address the underlying trauma that had created these patterns of really self sabotage in a lot of ways throughout my life.
Did the memories just come flooding back on their own, or did you do some work around it?
Yeah, I was doing some personal development and healing, alternative healing methods at that time. And they came back to me in a session. I did not have the tools I have today, and I wish that I did because what I experienced was reliving the emotions of that 8-year-old child as a 30-some-year-old woman, which was very overwhelming and confusing, but part of the healing process.
So what you're saying is that from 8 years old, you suffered a trauma and that it didn't really manifest itself and help you heal from it until you realized what was going on at the age of 35.
Correct. Yeah. Once I
And
was able to recall the event and heal through the emotional layers and components of it, it was then that I was able to really rewrite my own history with the relationship with myself and other people.
what all of us out there don't seem to realize, and maybe it is happening to somebody out there, that if you're finding that you have symptoms like Janessa had of serious eating disorders, because anorexia and bulimia, I'm sorry, is nothing to sneeze at, very, very serious situations. And also suffering from this for a long time and everything else that's going on, there may be underlying causes of trauma that you're not even aware of from an early childhood situation. So you turn this around and now you're helping others. But what we don't always know what trauma is. Could you define it for us?
Yeah, I love the simple definition that trauma is unresolved distress.
Unresolved distress.
Yep.
Is there and do you categorize that as being adversity? Are they the same thing?
Great question. I think there is a distinction between them that lies in the fact that adversity is the difficulties and challenges in life that we experience, where trauma is the emotions and it can manifest even into physical ailment. It's the experience that we continue to carry with us. So instead of reflecting back on things that have occurred to us in life and being grateful that they got us to where we are, we reflect back on those things with angst and discomfort and maybe disdain. And that is what I refer to as trauma, that distress that remains unresolved, where I feel like adversity is the circumstances that we live through every day in life that can be challenging. And it doesn't always have to be trauma related. But if we're not grateful for the things of the past, then we probably have some work to do to integrate really the wisdom that our life experience gifts us with.
And I think you're absolutely right. Trauma certainly is more deep-seated and deeply rooted. And the most astute thing is that if you seem to be reliving this event on a constant basis, then it is not just an adverse situation. Why do people constantly relive trauma? What's happening with that?
It's the parts of the brain that store the trauma. And the parts of our brain that store the trauma, the emotional processing center, and the visual components within the brain cannot actually delineate time. So the situations that happen to us, the traumatic situations, when they first occur, and when we experience a trauma trigger, so a situation that reminds our unconscious mind of the initial situation, we respond and react as though it's happening right now. And this is what causes when people overreact. You may see someone just acting outlandish about a situation that isn't uh, that big of a deal on the surface. Or even if you're more aware of yourself when you're saying, I had this thing happen, and it really doesn't make sense that it feels as enormous as it does, that can often be indicative of trauma being interwoven into that because the brain cannot tell the initial situation from real time right now, and it experiences it all the same.
So it always feels like a consistent deja vu in a way. It's constantly reoccurring. And it not only affects someone's emotions, it affects us physically as well, doesn't it?
It does. So when we don't process through the emotions and we push them down, I love the saying that the issue then stores in the tissue, and how that manifests into physical ailments depends upon the emotions that we're stuffing into our body or holding in our body, in our nervous system. But it really does manifest into various different physical ailments. And so in the trauma healing that I do with clients, one of the beautiful side effects is that the physical pain in their body will dissolve and dissipate too.
And of course, we know that if trauma isn't treated, it is not going to fade away, but it may also manifest itself in addiction. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Addiction is such a common coping mechanism for people to try to get away from the discomfort of the traumas they've experienced throughout life. And so, either through numbing or just wanting to feel better and in more elation, it can drive individuals into that initial relief, which then, with the way that the brain works, can become an addiction that we want more and more and more of. And so, there's honestly, I feel two forms of trauma that play into a very large percent of addiction, and that is not only our emotional traumas, but also the brain injury trauma that people will experience as well.
Talk a little bit about traumatic brain injury. What do you see in terms of your clientele?
Often we think I feel like we think of physical injury to the brain, getting hit in the head initially, right? But it's very frequent for me to see people who had high fevers in childhood also have trauma to the brain or medications. So we get caught in this cycle with addiction because we are moving into using a substance to get away from trauma, but then the substances that we're using is damaging our brain. And so then we can have the physical injury from the substances. And I also actually see the electric shock therapy causing trauma to the brain as well. So people will use this therapy to heal their anxiety or depression and support that aspect of themselves. But then when they're trying to stop using a substance, they continuously relapse, 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 and they're not having the full functioning in their brain in a way that's able to support their sobriety. And so through the healing work we do, it's fascinating. They're able to heal through the addiction and still not have to deal with the anxiety or depression or whichever disorders they were seeking out that electric shock therapy for in the beginning.
That's really amazing work. So what you're telling me is when someone comes to you with a plethora of diagnosis, the energy work that you do actually works on eliminating a lot of these things simultaneously. You don't take one thing at a time. You still work with an active addict at the same time you're working with a trauma or a traumatic brain injury.
Yeah, it's really, really fascinating work because people who are in active use, let's say smoking cigarettes, as they heal the underlying components, the underlying traumas, the physical injury trauma to the brain, they just merely want to smoke fewer cigarettes. And so there isn't this cold turkey, there isn't the withdrawal, there isn't the pain and the discomfort, and there's this natural releasing and not wanting it anymore. And their body, our bodies are so intelligent. When we tap into that innate wisdom, the body knows exactly what it needs to stay in a balanced place of letting go of the substance that's damaging the body while also not putting themselves into a place of withdrawal or discomfort. And so we address at the root, and in releasing the emotions, everything else has the ripple effect and is impacted as well.
So are you able to work with clients in a virtual setting or is it one-on-one in person?
I virtual. Yeah, I have done it all, but after, the last few years in the world, I feel like the best way to really serve people is virtually to have the greatest reach.
Which means Janessa is available to every one of us in the world to be able to take advantage of her. And we're going to talk some more about what she does. Can you tell us where to find you?
Yeah. So you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Fiercely Radiant Soul, the name of my business. You can find me on Facebook, Janessa Finley Ford as well. And then on my website, www.fiercelyradiantsoul.com, not only can you see my services, individual, group, and online services, you can also go to Eyes Wide Open, which is my internet radio show. And many of the topics that we've been talking about here today, from emotions to personality and beyond, are topics that we cover on that radio show where you can get more information as well.
So for everybody out there, Janessa's radio show is called Eyes Wide Open. And where is that radio show available?
Through my website is the easiest way to find that radio show. So www.fiercelyradiantsoul.com. Each week there's a different link for the live show. And so just going to my website will connect you with that ever evolving link that you need every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
And that website will be right there. You can see it right there on the screen in front of Janessa. So that's where you'll go and you'll see our radio show, Eyes Wide Open. Okay, so continuing on, the one thing that really is powerful for me is the fact that you're able to treat simultaneously an active alcoholic or addict and still handle the trauma at the same time. And I know many treatment centers are doing that, but you have a really great way of kind of rewiring the brain in that capacity. And that makes it a very exciting thing for someone who is suffering, because I have seen many of my clients come out of treatment clean and sober, but with not enough trauma work done. So it's great to be able to recommend that service that you have to all of my clients suffering from a consistent recurring trauma event. So that's marvelous. Now, let's talk a little bit about how you find other behaviors related to brain injury. What else are you seeing? What can you talk about?
Well, there's a shift that occurs in judgment. And I don't want to say there's impaired judgment. I don't love that language, but the judgment and the way that we make our judgments change with individuals who have brain injuries. There's also the impulsivity that comes with having brain injury trauma. And that delayed gratification is much less enticing than instant gratification and what we can have right away. And then, really, depending upon what brain injury that's involved, it can increase violence, it can decrease communication skills, it can decrease the emotional adeptness that a person has as well. And so this is really one of the most important aspects of my work, being tailorized to each individual to really go to the root of what is influencing their addiction or their discomfort or their symptoms that they show up wanting to alleviate.
One of the things that every active addict and alcoholic understands, and even those of us that are in remission and recovery, like the pushy broad, is still the feeling of I want what I want when I want it, and I want it right now, which is certainly has nothing to do with delayed gratification. It is 100% instant gratification. And what you're telling me is that sometimes the trauma and the brain injury will automatically put us in that mode of I want to have it now and I want to have it now, or I can't get out of this situation because all I can do is think of this now. So what you're saying is part of your work is to have us learn delayed gratification, and because of that really does help pull back the urge.
Yes, it absolutely does. There's also an element of personality that gets interwoven into what makes each of us our unique selves as well, that also drives that instant gratification versus delayed gratification. So it's a little bit twofold of the traumas that people experienced, and then also really learning the personality structure and using that for your gain rather than for your self-sabotage.
So this is extremely hopeful. Can you give us an idea of about how long on average you spend with a client that is going through this?
So the individuals that I work with addiction, I really like to work with them for a year because, as you've seen, there's so many different elements that play. I'll give an example of a client I had who she was quite young when she sought out her sobriety, and she was quite young when she started using around the age of 12 because her parents also used and she wanted something different from them. But part of getting her sober involved getting her out of the parents' house. And so we had many different elements to make sure that she was self-supportive, along with the mental health disorder, along with the addiction, along with the trauma. And so giving yourself at least a year to really work through all of the aspects that are going to set you up. And I like to say, build the foundation. So you don't build a house unless you have a foundation poured first. And sobriety is much the same. You're not going to sustain your sobriety and recovery if you don't have that solid foundation built beneath you. And that does take a little bit of time.
Without a doubt. I consider all of my clients newbies under 2 years clean and sober. Okay. You don't become anything other than a newbie unless you have at least 2 years. Give me the age range of clients that you work with.
So I really 18 and up is my
18
preference.
and up. Okay. All right. So what you're telling us is that there is hope of sustained recovery from childhood trauma.
There absolutely is. And even, one thing about my eating disorder, I'll step on a very mini soapbox for a minute, but the eating disorder was really challenging because I always envied people who use substances that they could just stop and walk away. And with an eating disorder, you really have to relearn to eat. You can't just not eat and live. And so there is so much hope in that comes from healing this trauma and sustaining a life where you are thriving and your relationships with yourself and everything around you, it also thrives. And it's going to be better than what you can ever imagine when you're sitting there and you're like, I just don't want to use anymore. And I don't even know if I'm capable of doing that.
Well, it's very important that you understand that you can overcome trauma and you can overcome adversity and addiction and really get a handle on your traumatic brain injury if you contact Janessa Finley Ford and you go to her website, fiercelyradiantsoul.com. Listen to her radio show, Eyes Wide Open. We have about 30 seconds left, Janessa. What do you want to leave us with?
Gosh, I just really want people to hear if you are like me and you feel like your addiction means that there was something wrong with you, that is not so. And being able to heal through your trauma and come to understand how the things that you've experienced in your life led you to where you are is going to actually be what sets you free.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad we have you today as a guest. This is Ellen Stewart, the Pushy Broad from the Bronx, saying thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is Ellen Stewart, the Pushy Broad from the Bronx, saying thanks for listening, and remember, everybody needs a little push.
From the pushy broad from the Bronx, New York.